Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. My name is Mwandwi Chileshe. I lead external engagements and advocacy at AGRA, and I'll be your moderator today. At AGRA, we've actually had a very exciting morning today, having received the Norman Borlaug Medallion by the World Food Prize Foundation here in Nairobi. So we come to this discussion very excited and very amplified and with all the enthusiasm to continue on the work that we've been doing. For our webinar today, we bring it back to conversations we've been having over the past few weeks. We have held conversations in relation to global shocks, fertilizer markets, but primarily Africa's food systems. The conversations have obviously surfaced some tensions, but they've also surfaced points of convergence, that the structural diagnosis of Africa's food systems and the vulnerabilities that exist there is no longer in dispute, but that locally produced solutions already exist and are available. What's also important is that financing must be co-designed with African institutions from the outset, and it's also recognized that CAADP remains the North Star against which progress must be measured. What this moment has made clear, having just gone through the crisis from the disruptions in the Straits of Hormuz, we know that from COVID-19 or whether it was the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that even beyond, the pattern is remaining consistent. Whether it's pandemics or wars or global shocks, the same structural vulnerabilities keep surfacing. So today's conversation, we're shifting. In the last one, if you were able to join us, you would know that we were trying to diagnose this problem and really explain what was currently happening. For today's conversation, we talked about resilience. Now, how do we take that resilience into action? We are streaming today simultaneously here on Zoom, but we are also on LinkedIn Live. We welcome you all from wherever you're joining from. Here on Zoom, please feel free to introduce yourselves and engage in the chat. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A section. If you're joining us from LinkedIn, please feel free to utilize the chat section. There too, introduce yourselves and where you're joining from, but also feel free to share your questions and thoughts in the comment section over on LinkedIn. I want to get to the speaker introduction. I'm very excited today because we have three very exciting speakers. The first speaker, somebody I know quite well and part of the AGRA team, is Professor Tilahun Amede. He is the Director for Climate Adaptation, Sustainable Agriculture and Resilience at AGRA. And Professor Tilahun leads AGRA's work on climate adaptation and sustainable farming, as I've mentioned. But his work is also grounded in decades of on-the-ground programming across the continent. His full bio is on the screen, as you will see, but we'll also paste it in the chat. So welcome, Professor Tilahun. We also have James Mutonyi, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the African Fertilizer and Agribusiness Partnership, commonly known as AFAP. And James leads AFAP, which is an organization working on the intersection of fertilizer policy, but also delivery across Africa, and is supporting a lot of last mile access. What I want to say about James is just an all-round great individual who is a consistent partner to AGRA, and you see his bio on screen and also in the chat. And lastly, we are also joined by Juni Wangari, who is the chairperson of the Organic Fertilizer and Input Manufacturers Association of Kenya, commonly known as OFIMAC. And Juni chairs OFIMAC and is representing Kenya's organic fertilizer manufacturing sector and advocating for the policy and market conditions that local producers need to scale. Her full bio, as you'll see, is also on screen and on the chat. So, folks, with that, let's get right into it. Our first speaker, Professor Tilahun. My first question goes to you. You, as I've introduced you, you really work on climate adaptation, but I just want to find out, how does your work on climate adaptation, sustainable farming, and your many years in AGRA, how does that inform what a genuinely resilience-centered response to the current fertilizer crisis look like? And what does AGRA's approach to the short, medium, and long-term response involve in practice? It'll be good to hear from you, Professor Tilahun. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mwandwi. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues, wherever you are. Yeah, probably I just take a minute to introduce AGRA. AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution Africa, 20 years old African institution, is working in 12 countries, but also continentally. And we have 5 major departments. We call them internally business lines. And one of the programs is called Sustainable Farming. And within Sustainable Farming program I lead, all the soil health issues, the input issues, the productivity issues are housed. And in our program, in general in AGRA also, we have two, among many others, two major outcomes. One outcome is really enhancing productivity of farms and systems in the continent. And the second outcome really is reducing risk and enhancing resilience of communities and countries. When we talk about enhancing productivity, it's all about really in the continent reducing yield gaps, what is achievable in the continent, in the countries, in the systems, in the counties, and what is produced, and really minimizing that difference. And that is done primarily, by making sure that appropriate inputs are used in appropriate amount and quality and are efficiently used. When we talk about, of course, inputs, nutrients are coming in, fertilizers are really the major inputs in the continent. In the second, outcome, we talk about enhancing resilience of farmers and the systems about reducing climate shocks, risks, but also market shocks. So we're really dealing with, major, disaster effects. And we bring in, advisories, climate advisory, market advisory, early warning systems, but also climate change management solutions, be it in the production, but also in post-harvest. And these two are strongly interlinked to each other. These outcomes are really interlinked to each other. You cannot talk about enhancing productivity and improving food security without addressing the climate issue and the market issue. But also you cannot talk about system resilience without addressing food security in the continent. So how we are trying to address the current crisis in Africa, particularly in our target countries, through AGRA's partnership, but also interventions on the ground, is by working at 3 different levels: a farm level, a country level, and a continental level intervention. So at farm level, we really help communities along with partners and countries to enhance the response capacity of farmers, improve farmer innovation, ensuring that the right inputs are really reaching to appropriate target groups, but also making sure that they are efficiently utilizing them. And we follow 3 interlinked approaches when it comes to resilience, be it for fertilizer, input, or climate. The first approach we follow is, improving the absorption capacity of communities and farmers. When we talk about improving absorption capacity is by making sure that, when the climate is good, when inputs are available, they make the best out of it and produce more for market, but also have food in their stores so that a seasonal shock is not disorganizing them. They have reserves that can help them to bypass a season or two. But also work with governments, with private sector, with banks to make sure that there is subsidy opportunities, targeted subsidy, a cost sharing and cost minimizing approach, but also a public support for farmers so that they absorb the shocks without being, disorganized and are selling out their assets. But also we then, at the same time, we help farmers to adapt to the shock. And to that, of course, we bring in tools, methods to the communities, to the counties, to the governments for targeting appropriate technology and practices. But also we promote, for example, nutrient saving mechanisms like microdosing, for example, really concentrating the available nutrients, whatever is available, in the root zone so that plants are utilizing and making the maximum out of it. But also we promote nutrient use efficiency, fertilizer and nutrient is just one of the inputs. There's water, there is, appropriate seed, there is agronomic practice. So how do you make sure that you enhance nutrient use efficiency? But also bringing in organic resources, alternative nutrient sourcing so that we improve the soil conditioning to be for the plant to be more efficient, but also to add nutrients from beyond fertilizers, beyond mineral fertilizers. So there are different sourcing. So we promote alternative nutrient sourcing, composting, the green manuring, all those regenerative practices, manures. All these are also, other additional and important nutrient sources that can compensate a bit of the mineral nutrients that are really missing. We promote a lot, improved farming systems by bringing in more nutrient fixing legume crops in the system, but also making sure that there's an efficient use of nutrients again, and that of course also strongly relates to water management in the continent. We are called sub-Saharan Africa because of drought, recurrent drought. Even if you have nutrients, if you don't have enough water for the plant to grow, the efficiency is very low. So we also promote, appropriate choice of varieties, early maturing varieties, drought-resistant varieties, and good agronomy. And we know from the scientific work we have been doing, different landscapes behave differently in terms of nutrient sourcing and nutrient responses. The valley bottoms usually, which are deeper soils, good water holding capacity, are much more responsive than hilly sides. So if you have really only 10 kg of fertilizer, so you go for the most responsive landscape positions, which are usually in flatlands, in valley bottoms, but also crop choices. We promote crops that are responding to fertilizers. Legumes are responding less than, for example, maize. So if you have 10 kg, you prefer to give it to more responsive crops and more responsive varieties like maize than a legume. And we work a lot in terms of organic and inorganic spectra, and we make sure that, for example, in our regenerative agriculture, agroecology work, we promote homestead management through organic resources so that, at least quarter of the land is not demanding external input, that are relying on inputs that are available in the household, while the outfields are usually depleted and require a bit of, inorganic resources. So the third approach we promote is really make sure that while we work on immediate demands and appropriate solutions for today and tomorrow, but also transformational soil health management, interventions. That is related to landscape management. You can work on a farm, but if landscapes are not managed, the upstream farmer can release his flood and everything can be washed away. So we work a lot on nutrient sourcing, for example, and promoting also available nutrients that are within the countries. For example, the mujungus in Tanzania, in Angola, the potashes in Ethiopia. So we promote, the production of nutrients, of fertilizers within the continent using the available resources, particularly those which are really producing oil, have the basic ingredients to produce nitrogen. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, Uganda, and now coming Ethiopia. So these are also countries which really, in long term, can be transformational, can produce enough amount of fertilizer for themselves and for the region. And most importantly, we work also with continental players like the African Union Commission. For example, we helped the African Union supported in organizes African Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit in 2024, and now we're helping countries, but also regional, programs and players like ECOWAS, East African Community, but also countries in domesticating action plans that have been endorsed by the African Union, integrating the soil health management, organic, inorganic, landscape, water, into their investment priorities. And of course, all this has to align with the country's priorities themselves. So we really identify entry points in every country and making sure that, whatever we do is integrated into the bigger country plans. But make sure that soil health is prioritized equally and investment and becoming one of the investment priorities in the continent. So all of this cannot be done without really stronger alliance with countries, but also with partners on the ground. So we work a lot with different partners, with governments, with NGOs, with CGIR centers, knowledge hubs, but also, like-minded institutions in the continent, because soil health demands strong alignment. And there are so many players. We need the policymakers, we need the regulatory mechanisms, be it in regulatory quality control, subsidies, import, export, all that. But also we need the private sector. Private sector is a major source of not of nutrient sourcing, but also the major drivers of demand, the market demand. So we work a lot with them, but also with the extension institutions, extension departments, with the last mile. And we in AGRA, in countries where the public extension system is weak, we promote what we call VPS, the village-based advisors. These are like young people, usually university graduates, but didn't have jobs, dropouts, or even elite farmers who really are keen to try out innovations, support themselves, but also support their communities at the same time, and link it to markets to make a bit of living. And those are becoming very, very important instruments in the continent. And we, in some countries, are even becoming the major extension and last mile delivery agents, and even getting promoted to agro dealers and making sure that farmers have access to critical inputs. And all of this, of course, is important when the policies function. So we have a department, a business line, which is working on policies and institutional capability and capacity to make sure that whatever we do is aligning, but also the gaps in policy are strengthened at different levels. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Andre.
Thank you very much, Professor Tulun. I think you elaborate quite a lot of not just sort of what this crisis is, but also what it is that we try to do on a day-to-day basis at AGRA, but also the opportunities of what this means for even when we are in global shocks. What does this mean for creating jobs? What does it mean for ensuring that systems work better? I'm going to turn now to James Mtonyi, as who I introduced is the CEO at AFAP. James, again, good to have you on. I just want to be able to draw on your experience from AFAP and also in African fertilizer systems. What does the evidence of the past 2 decades really tell us about actually what drives change at scale, and what does that mean for the most credible and urgent actions available to us right now? I ask this in the context of knowing that AGRA ourselves, we are celebrating 20 years, but it's really through partners and kind of the work that you are doing that we've been able to also see how some of this shows up in the ecosystem. So over to you, James, with that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelisha. Thank you for having me. By way of introduction, the African Fertilizer and Agribusiness Partnership, AFAP, we are a catalytic non-profit organization formed way back in 2012. And our main mission, of course, is to transform Africa's agricultural sector by improving access to fertilizer and, of course, other inputs. We play a pivotal role. I mean, we've been partners for AGRA since 2012 when we were established. And currently, we have an operational base in 8 countries across mostly mostly sub-Saharan Africa and in West Africa as well. At AFAP, we work around 3 main services, agribusiness and market development services. We recognize the fact that agribusinesses need to expand their market outreach in terms of the inputs and the services that they provide to the farmers, the smallholder farmers, who are the core in terms of the people who want to reach for increased agricultural productivity. Then we offer financial services, which I'm going to be speaking a lot to this afternoon, because we recognize that financial services actually are critical if we are to sustain or attain the developmental agendas, especially in terms of food production. Then we need to have the SMEs support. They need financial services. So at FAP, we support them through trade credit guarantees and other financial services, mainly targeting small and micro enterprises involved in the agricultural value chain. And finally, we also have work on policy, working very closely with governments and other partners on issues of policy. Because when you look at fertilizer and fertilizer access, a lot of it is governed through policies. And some of the policies that through government may affect or may have an impact on whether farmers are able to produce or not produce. And so policy is a very key for FAP. So looking at the evidence for the past 20 years, FAP, we've been here for 14 years now, 15, working closely with AGRA. The key that we are looking at here is accessibility. The evidence tells us that if the smallholder farmers are able to access the inputs or the fertilizers, then there will be increased production. And so that is what the evidence tells us. The main key issue is accessibility. But then where the challenge comes in, and as we look towards how do we now able to have these inputs adapted to scale, is issues of now appropriate fertilizers, the appropriate nutrients. And when you look at the small and micro enterprises that we're working with, yes, there's a lot of knowledge down there. There's a lot of farming knowledge, but the question remains accessibility. And anytime you go down to the ground, you realize that the farmers are only able to purchase or access what the agro dealer has in stock for them. And unfortunately, most of the agro dealers don't have the appropriate nutrients with the appropriate fertilizers for the farmers. And so the farmer only is able to access what the agro dealer has. And so that is where we are looking at in terms of how do we put this up to scale. And it's in our opinion, and it's from the evidence, is that if you're able to support these small and micro enterprises to have the wide variety of these fertilizers and inputs, then we'll be able to increase production. We will be moving away from the issues of blanket recommendations and going into actually crop and soil specific nutrients that are required by the farmers. What we are saying is that the yields need to speak to the evidence, or the yields needs to speak to the investment, because there's a lot of investment. I mean, okay, over the past 20 years, we've invested, AGRA has invested heavily in support of inputs access to farmers. I think we've doubled or tripled the number of SMEs. In some countries, we've even tripled the usage of fertilizers and other inputs. But then again, when we look at sub-Saharan Africa and most of the countries where we operate, the increase in terms of the yields is not commensurate with the investment. We are still looking at probably 1 to 2 tons per hectare if we are looking at cereals, on an average, a world average of 4, or if we are looking at more of the development world where yields can reach up to 7 to 10 metric tons per hectare. So what we see on the ground is that the farmer will access what is at the agro-dealer level, but the agro-dealer does not have all the fertilizers that are required. So we are asking ourselves, can we invest heavily through financial systems, maybe financial instruments? Can we de-risk? Because the bigger question, even when you look at some of the SMEs that are close or the last mile to the farmer, they lack the financial capacity and the financial muscle to be able to stock all the inputs that are required by the farmer. And so what the farmer settles for is what is best next available. or what is best available at the agro-dealer level. And in most cases, what is best available is not what is most appropriate, and it will not give him the maximum yields that he would require. And so they settle for less. So when we are saying, so like at FAP, we have a trade credit guarantee, but our trade credit guarantee normally have been de-risking at the higher level, the people we call the hub agro dealers and the fertilizer companies. And now, of course, we have we also have a credit guarantee for seed companies as well. But that is at the higher level from the companies all the way to the hub agro dealers. But what we are asking now, or what we require to invest in heavily is now, how do we de-risk at the smaller level, at the last mile, at the retailer, so that they're able to access these financial instruments and be able also to supply and be able to avail all these inputs back to the farmer. The challenge, of course, we face is when we're talking about small and micro enterprises involved in the agriculture value chain. A lot of them are looked at as not creditworthy. These are conversations we've been having for as long as I've been in this sector. And the issues is, how now do we bridge that gap? And we ask and we say, of course, I think there are instruments out there if we can invest heavily in trade credit guarantees, not grants, not loans, just trade credit guarantees, work with other partners and the companies to ensure that all these, that the small and micro enterprise right at the village level has the required inputs. And then from there, of course, then we can now partner with the other organizations that deal directly with farmers. Because even if, I mean, we have partners within this sector that we work with, people who support direct farmer training. And even if those who do that support to farmer training, it does not really matter what kind of knowledge the farmer has if the farmer is not able to access the inputs. It will just be a question, yes, he knows the knowledge, he knows what is required, but the inputs are not available. So that's what the evidence is telling us for 20 years. And if we have to go to scale, then we need to really relook at how we can de-risk, how we can have all these inputs available right down at the small and micro business level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And I noticed that in the chat, we're getting quite a few questions that are quite specific to fertilizer markets and what this actually means. So I'm glad that you talked a little bit about what this means for smallholder farmers. We will get to a segment just to reassure the people in our chat where we are able to address some of the questions after we hear from all three of our speakers, and they can elaborate a little bit more on the specifics that have been raised. And on that note, I want to turn to Junie, who is our other speaker for the day. Really good to have you all on board. And so really just, if for all of you that don't know Junie, very exciting voice in this space, but also does quite a lot of work and is representing OFIMAC, as I had earlier introduced. And really, from what you have heard from both Tilahun and James, my question to you is, how does the Organic Fertilizer and Input Manufacturers Association, OFIMAC, view the current moment, the current crisis, but even as we're getting into the point where we emerge from the crisis at the opening up of the straits, what is it that it will really take in terms of policy, procurement, and financing for local input producers to move from the margins to the center of Africa's soil health and fertilizer resilience agenda? So over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this call, and thank you for having us as OFIMAC. So first, allow me to introduce OFIMAC. We are an association of organic fertilizer producers, and I'm the chairperson. I'm an organic fertilizer producer myself, and so I find myself walking this journey as a participant in that space as well. So when we are advocating for our manufacturers, I'm advocating for myself and 17, 18 other manufacturers that we have as members. But of course, that is not the only number of manufacturers in Kenya. We believe that there could be 50 plus manufacturers, but I believe that soon they will join us in this work, because we only just started. We were registered in 2024, and so we're still pretty young. A group of MSMEs and one or two SMEs, but still at the very inception stage. And so we have a long way to go. I cannot belabor the fact that we are in the best place that we can possibly be at this time, because the chorus is all about how do we improve soil health in Africa. And I will be very honest to say that, the voice of organics came out very loudly during the Africa Fertilizer Soil Health Summit that was held in Nairobi in May in 2024. Before then, organics came into play, after COVID, when we all know the world shut down, there were no fertilizers available. When they became available, they were very expensive. And so, in Kenya, at the time, there were about 3 local producers who were producing, organic products, and but they were not known, and they were operating independently. And but as soon as the market opened up, the fertilizers are selling at 7,000 shillings a bag of 50 kg. Then farmers were looking for alternatives, and so the organics conversation started taking shape. But I would say we really came to the table in 2024. Since then, it's been a very exciting journey. For Kenya specifically, I would say I'm glad that I live in Kenya, because the support that the government has given us, it has been amazing. From the Nairobi Declaration, it is very clear that this work cannot be done alone. And what we did as OFIMAC is to be at the table and to be at the center stage. We must be at the center stage with a key client, and that is the government. And so, when you look at today, how do the fertilizers move in the market, from whether it's manufacturers or importers to the farmer? And most of the fertilizers are going through the government subsidy, or they have a government voice, or they're in a government program. And so we felt that it was very, very important for us to be able to find a seat on that table. Secondly, it's also because you cannot speak a soil health if you're not talking about organic carbon. And organic carbon is contained in organic products, organic fertilizers, soil conditioners, biostimulants, biofertilizers. So, we cannot be operating on the sidelines. So our mission is also to ensure that we support the government to achieve the commitments that were made in the Nairobi Declaration. And perhaps I'll just remind us what these are, and because these are actually our driving force, our motivation. And one is to triple domestic production of organic and inorganic fertilizers and the other objective is to reverse land degradation and restore soil health in majority of our degraded lands. In 2014, a research work was done, and that indicated that about 50% of land in Kenya is degraded. So it's lacking core nutrients like NPK, zinc, and calcium. It's it's low in organic soil, organic carbon, low pH. That means it's highly or strongly soil acidic. And so the challenges are huge. But these challenges are also opportunities for us to capitalize on. And so these are some of our motivating factors that help us wake up every day. And so for us to be able to achieve that, we need to make sure that we are able to supply organic farm inputs that are of excellent quality. We ensure that we are also, reducing the logistics of supply. James talked about accessibility, distribution. The inorganic fertilizers are readily available in the agro dealers' shops. We're not there yet as organic farm inputs, so to speak, in Kenya. Our market share is it's under 2% of the fertilizer fertilizer consumption in Kenya. So we are still very small. So we are not there at the outlets. We're not there in the heart and mind of the farmer. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But we can only do that if we have the market. Market access is key. We have had a huge challenge in terms of penetrating the market. The farmers have been using inorganic fertilizers for on average 80 years plus in Kenya. And so today, when you're introducing a new product, you're being compared to products that work almost like magic. You know, I put it in the soil in 2 weeks. The plant is germinated, and so the expectations are very high. So by the time you're convincing the farmer that it will take some time, you need to heal your soils, it's a long conversation, and so the farmer is not very quick to pick up the product. And then we have the government subsidy, which on its own, it's an absolutely useful tool to ensure that our farmers are able to afford the farm inputs. However, it has also unfortunately brought about market how do I put this? Competition within the sector, and so you find that the organic products become more expensive or are perceived to be more expensive than the government subsidy. We cannot be able to beat that price. So you find that the farmers, in as much as they like and appreciate what organics can do, they're not able to purchase them because they say it's expensive. And so for the last 5-10 years, we as organic fertilizer producers have been talking to farmers to say shift from inorganic to organic. That shift, it's not happening because the productivity is not guaranteed. The farmer is still very scared, and then now there's affordability issues. So we find ourselves in a little bit of a trap. But with this new platform of Africa Fertilizer Soil Health conversation, then we find ourselves at the center stage of even developing the Kenya fertilizer, the Kenya Soil Health action plan, where we are involved to see how we can really work together with the inorganic sector of our business to drive this conversation forward. And I'm happy to report that in Kenya, we're doing that very well. We're working with Fertilizer Association of Kenya and their members, who now, their focus is on ensuring that the farmers are able to access inorganic fertilizers. And we are now working towards ensuring that we are able to supply organic fertilizers and other soil amendments along the way, so that we can complement these two nutrients. Our first speaker from AGRA was talking about integrating, supply of the nutrients, both organic and inorganic. And so that is actually the platform against which we are working, so that when we're going to the market, we are not competing with the inorganics anymore. Neither is the inorganic competing with the organic fertilizers anymore, but we're actually speaking one voice in that we need to integrate these nutrients together so that the farmer can reap the benefits. One of the immediate benefits that the farmer will realize is nutrient use efficiency, which will increase productivity immediately, up to a minimum or an average of 20 to 30% crop productivity. So these are activities and results that have already been established, and we believe that there are key selling points that will help the farmer to pick up the products. Markets are key, but the government is actually the center stage to put this whole story together. And so we need government support, and that is where now it comes in terms of policies. What kind of policies do we have in place to support this movement? And I'm happy to report that in Kenya, the policies in place do really favor the work that we are doing today. In 2024, we launched the agriculture soil management policy. That was in 2023 during the summit. And then later on in the year, we launched the National Agroecology Strategy for food transformation. And so we have policies and strategies that will help us to achieve what we need to achieve as far as soil health is concerned. But then now that takes us into how do we procure these products? So these are some of now the things that we know that we're going to have to cross, to experience, to see whether we'll be able to cross over to the other line. But the Ministry of Agriculture has been very supportive, and we have commitments that they'll be putting us in the government subsidy very soon, so that then we can sell these products together. And then to the point whereby we are even able to make recommendations. Today, the recommendations are on the inorganic fertilizers alone, but we're looking at a situation whereby we'll be able to give recommendations both for organic and inorganic at the same time. And that will be promoting the integrated soil fertility management approach that will drive the soil health agenda moving forward. Financing will be very key. As this would be my last point, but financing will be very key in driving this forward, and that is why it is very important to work with the government and as well as the large importers of the inorganic fertilizers to help catalyze the organic space, the organic manufacturing space, but with guaranteed markets and guaranteed revenues, then we are also able to scale up. So the journey is long, but we have the capacity and the capability to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Junie. Professor Tilohun talked about integrated soil health management, and I'm glad you brought up also the Africa Soil Health and Fertilizer Summit that happened. I think, and it's really good to then hear how this is happening in practice. I saw somebody in the chat, I think named Bear Okello, talk about complementarity rather than competition, because if we're going to be able to get towards these goals, we have to be able to have this conversation that bring all of these pieces together. But it's also, you've talked about markets, but what's the role of government? What's the role of private sector? And how do we get everybody on board to this? With that, I actually want to open up the discussion to all of the panelists, and I'll go to James first. We had a few questions that came in even before the webinar happened, and one of those questions came from Dr. Nyarongo from Malawi. And what he was talking about is we've seen a lot of resilience frameworks that have proliferated in African food systems discourse over the last decade, and yet food insecurity has deepened. And I think it also points to some of the points you talked about in terms of the investments that have gone in, not matching some of what we are seeing. And it's important that we address some of those tensions. So his question ends with, what does genuine action actually look like, and how do we move from excellent analytical frameworks to the political will and financing commitments that are needed to implement at the speed that these kinds of crisis demands? So over to you, James, for your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Chelisha, and thank you for the question as well. When you look at the investments that AGRA has done, I mean, basically, I would say AGRA has been great in terms of pushing the green revolution and the food agenda in Africa, per se. But then the question is, how do we take this to scale? And from the question that has been asked, if I just draw from the examples that we have, or from the work that we are doing at EFA, currently, I need to recognize and appreciate two of our partners who are walking this journey with us. That is the African Development Bank, which is supporting a fertilizer financing mechanism in 3 countries, helping de-risk fertilizer in 3 countries. And then we have the Development Finance Corporation, the US, which is also putting some significant resources to help de-risk in terms of getting fertilizers closer to the farmers in the kind of the required fertilizers to the farmers. But when you look at the value of these investments, though big, they're basically scratching the market. I mean, in a country like, let's say, Kenya and Uganda, where we have some of these programs going on, we are barely reaching, in terms of SMEs, we are barely reaching to 300, about 300 to 400 SMEs. And those are the people we are supporting with the financial tools. And when we look in the areas in which some of the SMEs, we see change. We see growth. But then the investments themselves are low. If we could scale up, then we'll be talking about excellence. but we still work in small silos, in small programs that are not to scale. And I think there's still a lot of even with the Africa development, but there's still a lot of perceived risk, and how deep or how low can they get, and people are not willing to take the risk. There's no risk appetite in terms of supporting the small and micro enterprises. So if we are able to go to that scale, a much bigger scale, then we'll be talking about excellence. From what Uni has just spoken a few minutes ago, she talks about the OFIMAC, which FAP is part of. But then if you would ask her how many of her products or how many of her members have their products down available to the farmers, there are very few. And or how many retailers are stocking their inputs? I know they have very wonderful products, but how many retailers are stocking their inputs? Again, there are very few. And then if you were to ask her how much credit would she give, how much can she be able to provide in terms of credit support to the SMEs, because most of the SMEs may not be able to have the capital to stock all her inputs. Again, she becomes hesitant, and she does not have the resources available. So I'm looking at having programs that address some of these challenges to scale, not limited to a small country, not limited to a section of a country, but just blanket to scale and bring in the resources. Maybe government would come in here and other funding partners, including the World Bank, and look at this as a major program and not something that is invested in small silos over a small period of time, like 2 to 3 or 4, 5-year programs. We should be looking at a long-term 10-year action plan on providing financial services, the same way we looked at the African Soil and Health Plan, the 10-year African Soil Health Plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to you, Prof. Feel free to comment on the question that was asked, but also another question in the chat from a familiar name, Vanessa Adams. And her question was really about how do we also talk about addressing financial and the food security implications of the current high fertilizer prices, but also the trade disruptions that have happened, as well as sort of the huge agricultural productivity that exists at the same time and inequities in African rural communities. What is it that we need to do to enhance investment in a reliable water supply for productive food supply? So over to you, Professor Tilo, and so you can comment on the last one as well as address Vanessa's question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. Just wanted to, capitalize on what James has said. I think the major challenge why things are not moving, why we are not achieving food security in the continent, is largely because most of our investments are short-term. Our politicians are usually, addressing issues that are current, of course, are urgent. And the ingredients for resilience, for long-term productivity, are really getting attention. When I'm saying this, I'd like to talk about two things. If you see, for example, and correlate agricultural productivity, climate, mainly weather, and the GDP of countries, there is a very, very strong correlation. When the weather is bad, when drought is happening, the whole economy gets down, productivity gets down. When the season is good, again, you see a boom in productivity, but also a boom in GDP. So what it means is that, there are also externalities. Weather plays a very, very important role. This has been demonstrated in Zimbabwe, in Ethiopia, in Kenya for many, many years. You see, the last 20 years, very strong correlation. So what it means is, besides the really critical inputs like fertilizer and seed, there's an investment required in water resource management, in irrigation, in rainwater management. If this is the amount of rain we get in the continent, total amount, is the same, doesn't change for the last 50 years. What is changing is the distribution. So how do you make sure that you we map, we conserve, we store, and we efficiently utilize the rainwater resources. But also where there are surface water accesses, how do we improve the irrigation efficiency and go beyond the one-ton agriculture? If you see how Asia has transformed, India has been transforming using groundwater, and no country almost nil in the continent. People are not using even very water-rich countries. If you dig like 5 meters, you can get water, but even those shallow wells are not utilized, partly because of lack of investment, basic investment like water lifting facilities. So I think bringing the water agenda and bringing also the watershed, the landscape management agenda, building soil health over time. A colleague talked about building soil carbon. Yeah? It needs a century, a decade for that to really move. And degraded sandy soils, whatever input you bring in, even if, even the high yielding varieties are not really producing in a field. We have seen that in the continent, and that's really where a systemic approach is required. When it comes to really Vanessa's question, is the talk of the day. Again, because of very tiny soils, land tenure systems in most countries, but also lack of mechanization. If you go to countries like Mozambique, Zambia, where there's a lot of land, some of the smaller farmers, they may have 10 hectares of land, but they can plow only half a hectare and plow with a hoe culture. Yeah? For most of Africa, to plow half a hectare of land, you need at least 4 strong boys for 4 days, to plow and make it ready for production. How can you transform agriculture with a hoe culture unless you bring in mechanization? And that mechanization can happen through, engagement of the private sector, mainly, in Ethiopia, for example, they are using this clustering of farms. Smaller farmers come together, and then demand services, be it extension, fertilizer, mechanization, and the government is co-investing. So that type of approach, which is a scale approach, is required to improve food security. And in situations like where we are, in terms of, what do we do in short term? There are, I think, very, very important challenges. I think subsidies, in some countries, even food aid is quiet, but we also see a very limited interest from the traditional development partners to finance. And that's where I think governments should invest in like irrigation, so that we can bring in food in the next 3-4 months, but also making sure that there's a bit of subsidy, targeted subsidy. And the challenge we are facing in the continent is subsidies usually are either political or are favoring better organized farmers, high income farmers who have a voice and negotiation power. So that targeting of really smaller farmers, fragile systems is very, very important. And of course, cross-country trade could minimize cost, minimize transportation, but also have improvement and all that. Of course, rules and regulations have to align among countries. I can stop here.
Thank you very much, Prof. My internet dropped for just a second, so I hope I didn't miss much, but I got the majority of what you communicated. We have 2 questions that I'll pose to Juni, which one from our YouTube stream from Margaret Chimpikiso, and she asked, have you been able to standardize organic products for your members? And then the second, so it's ensuring that there's some sort of standardization is what I assume the question is about. And then the second question is from Messi Piri from Zambia. And she says, thank you for the insightful presentation, but also notes that if organic fertilizers currently account for only 2% of Kenya's fertilizer market, despite the opportunities created by FCTA, what policy, financing, and regulatory reforms do you believe are most critical to accelerate adoption and scale regional trade in organic fertilizers across Africa? Additionally, what opportunities do FCTA present that can be better leveraged to create a competitive market? So over to you, Junie.
Thank you. Yes, standards are very key. And in Kenya, we do have organic fertilizer standard. And actually, that is also an East Africa standard. So it covers the 6 East African markets. How well it has been put into practice remains a challenge. And so we have actually got to a point whereby we've realized that we are not able to import products using the current standards. So there'll be a lot of work in terms of reviewing existing standards so that we are able to facilitate trade. And so once we do that, then we should be able to move the products around. And reducing market entry barriers. We find currently, even if I have the product has been certified as a East African standard against the East African standard product, if I go to another country, I'd have to do market trials. That's another 2 years. So the products will not move into the market that quickly. If every time you're making entry into a new market, yet you're certified, you have to do trials for 2 seasons. And so we need to intentionally reduce these entry barriers and these policies and procedures that are currently in place. And well, it's good to have them, but once we start walking this journey, you realize that they're not working. So we need to intentionally remove them, and to do that quickly as well. I mean, to actually change a standard or to develop a new standard, it takes maybe a minimum a year. Why should it take a year? We should be able to develop a standard and gazette it in 90 days at the bare minimum. So these are some of the things that we will need to intentionally remove, reduce, so that we can facilitate trade. Please remind me the second question. I think the second question was a bit, I didn't get the second question.
I think the second question was mainly was the one from Messi Piri, and it was about she talked about if organic fertilizers currently account for only about 2% of Kenya's fertilizer market, despite the opportunities already created by FCTA. What policy, financing, and regulatory reforms do we believe are most critical to accelerate it? But also, what are the ways in which we can better leverage FCTA to create a competitive market?
Yeah, I think I've more or less answered both in terms of standards, reducing the barriers to entry, financing. I think there was a point where I mentioned we need a guaranteed market. So today, as James said, you give me an order of 10,000 tons. Today, I don't have that stock, and I also can't produce. However, we can unlock that opportunity. When you ask me to supply 10,000 tons, pay me upfront and give me a schedule of supply, and we get started. I think today we are in a space whereby now we expect that tomorrow we can be able to order tons and tons and hundreds of tons of organics, and you will not find them anywhere, at least not in Africa. And so Rome was not built in one day. And I think we need to also now manage our expectations in terms of how now do we move from 2% to 5% to 10 to 30 to 50 as quickly as possible. And this will only happen when we intentionally move towards getting things done and changing some things that have been in place for the last 10, 15 years, things that we believe should take two years to change. We need to intentionally say no. This is urgent. It should not take more than 90 days. It should not take more than 6 months. We should pay upfront. I should not hold your money because I need you to produce and keep supplying. I need you to scale up because in the next season, we will need double the stocks. So that will only happen when we oil this wheel, in totality. And then key is to also ensure that the farmer at the end of the day is able to sell their produce. Because if the farmer produces a big harvest, because he will, he will have a bumper harvest. Then where will he take his double portion of potatoes and and maize and everything else that he has grown? So we also need to integrate the market for the produce, the farm produce, so that everybody in the value chain is working, and this has to happen at the same time. So we can't move in isolation. So all these pieces must move at the same time. And so, but it has to have intentionality. And that is all that we need, but we can make things work. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Something I've been very keen on since we started these conversations over the last few weeks is also to have people that are going to bring in kind of the financing discussion, because you talked about, if I don't have the capital up front, how am I going to be able to make this work? I've seen a few references in the chat as well, for instance, to the projects that have been started by Dangote, and some of those projects now, when we take that to a large scale, will require large scale financing. So hopefully in some of our next conversations, some of the speakers we can have can also speak to us around what is it that it's going to take to be able to unlock financing, both at kind of at the smallholder level. How do you unlock financing for the big projects? How do you ensure insurance for people who are in organic fertilizers? How do you ensure insurance for smallholder farmers? I think these are topics that we can continue to unpack in the series that we're having. On that note, I know that there's quite a few other questions, but we also try to ensure that we keep the conversations to just 15 minutes past 4 p.m. East African time. So I'm just going to go for one last round, starting with Professor Tilahun. If there's any last remarks you want to make or anything you've observed from the chat that you would like to respond to, just 2 to 3 minutes, Prof, and then we'll move to James, and then we'll end with Junie.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Mandwe. Very interesting discussion. I just want to highlight two things. There are always questions to say why yield is not moving, why yield is not changing. A very fair question. I am a systems agronomist, and I know the challenges. The challenges are that, for one, farmers have preferential treatments for their farms. Some farms are better fertilizer, better managed than other farms. And these are usually farms where, high value crops are grown, yeah? Vegetables, fruits, which are really bringing money and cash. And those highly managed systems are usually depending on organic resources, crop residues produced on other farms. So there's a lot of nutrient movement from the cereal farms to high value crop farms. And you usually see a boost in productivity in certain farms, which are preferred ones, and then land degradation in other parts of the farms. And that is a deliberate management of farmers. And even if you apply fertilizers there, you'll not get much out of it. So how do we make sure that we optimize systems? And I think Jenny has really presented very well. There's a very, very serious shortage of biomass in the system. I myself was a scientist in the CGIAR system, and I was trying to optimize biomass. And from my work, I was saying to produce 3 tons of maize in a certain plot, a farmer has to move the organic biomass from 85 tons of part of the farm to 15 parts of farm. So you can produce 3 tons with organics without adding any external nutrient on 15% of the farm, but you have to move that biomass from 85% of the farm. So what do you do in that 85%? It's a land degradation, and even a yield decline. Yeah. So what do we do there? Then that's what we're saying: bring in agroforestry systems, bring in green manures, bring in water conservation. All these are investments which are long term. Yeah. And we see also investments not coming together. If you bring fertilizer, water has to be there. The appropriate variety has to be there. Good agronomic management has to be there. So most of our investments are spread, yeah, even government investments. So that's really what we're trying to do even in AGRA, even ourselves. How do you make an integrated, farm, typology farm typology-based farm and agronomic recommendation. Yeah? That's a big challenge. The second thing I said, for all of this, water is dictating. Water management should be part of our really investment for today and for the future. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is our weak extension system. In most countries, we have technologies, we have practices, but farmers are not getting the appropriate inputs with advisories, but also the information is diluted. It's not targeted. It's like a district-based or a county-based recommendation doesn't help a farmer to really improve yield in his 1 hectare, 2 hectares, because there's a huge diversity even within a county, within a landscape, even within a family farm. So appreciating that diversity is very, very important. And all these are really holding us back from moving yield. But I think, the clustering approaches, the targeting approaches, farmer innovations, all these integrated solutions, organic, inorganic, along with water and seed, and strong exchange system really has to come together to move yield beyond really a 2-ton or 1-ton agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I also just want to acknowledge that we did get a question from Usman Sonongo from Mali, who did pose a question towards our policy and state capability program and collaboration with African governments. We will make sure that we get that to our team on the PSC side. But for now, I want to turn to James. Anything in the chat that has caught your eye? Anything that you want to comment on in terms of the last comments?
Thank you. And drawing in from what professors just talked about, yes, farming is very challenging indeed. And speaking from the background of fertilizer alone probably will not, but it plays a big role. This year, there's already talk about El Nino, El Nina. And so some of the gains that we have made in the past 3-4 years, again, we may lose some of those gains. But just looking at its simplicity is that a lot of the times, in fact, a lot of the times, we are drawn to the fact that fertilizer is expensive. As an absolute figure, it may be expensive, maybe $50, $40, $60 a bag, depending on the fertilizer, the market in which you're operating, as opposed to maybe seed. Seed may just cost you a couple of dollars, $2, $3. Then you have 2-kilogram packet of seed. And so the notion that fertilizer is expensive, and that is why farmers don't use fertilizer. Yes, in simple terms, we can say it's expensive. But then when you look at it in terms of productivity, in terms of yields, and from all the literature we have, from all the data, we know that in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we have the lowest yields per hectare. In fact, at times, maybe even 10% what some of the developed countries are getting. We look at maize. You look at the US market, maybe 9-10 tons per hectare. Here we're talking about 1 ton, 2 tons. And when we are really doing well, 3-4 tons. So which means is that we may be investing in the fertilizer, but the yields are not coming in through. And so that's where the discourse is, and that's where the challenge is. And back to my original discussion, if we can have the appropriate fertilizer, if the farmer can put that mineral into the soil, that fertilizer, whatever, into the soil, and doubles or triples his yields, then we'll not be talking about fertilizer being expensive, because the investment is there. You're spending $100 on fertilizer and you're getting $1,000, just by example, in terms of yields. And so we really need to look at it, balance the act there. And so why the farmer requires is the appropriate. We talk about soil tests, soil health. Yes, we talk about biomass. We talk about all kinds of minerals that you may put into the soil. But if you can put it there and prove it to the farmer, and as long as we continue to apply blanket fertilizers in most of the areas, then farmers will always say it's expensive, because the yields that they are getting do not speak to the investment they've put. So my closing remarks is that let's invest a lot in how we can have the correct and the recommended fertilizers, plus other inputs, of course, available at the smallholder level, at the last mile, at the agro dealer, the person in the village. Let him have all those inputs. I can assure you, I think, then you'll start speaking a different language. You'll start saying, yeah, somebody will remove his own resources and go and buy the fertilizer. He will not wait for the government subsidized fertilizer. Anything that helps you, you go on and you invest it in yourself. So I think I'll be probably taking the discussions further. I think with some of the colleagues or some of the comments from the chat, I'll be responding to some of, I think some people have sent me requests, and we'll take it further and see how we can increase or how we can have more financing and development at the last mile in the SME section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. There was actually a question that had come from John, which was about what do we mean when we talk about appropriate fertilizer. So I'm glad that you elaborated on that point as well, in terms of what it means. And I think that in terms of also just the majority of the questions, you did a good job of ensuring that we're able to speak to that. But as you have said, it would be great that you keep engaging with people that have reached out. Junie, I'm turning to you for any last comments, anything that has stood out to you in the chat, the Q&A, anything else that the speakers have said. Over to you in the last, we have about 4 or 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At the risk of sounding like a record player, we cannot underestimate the need to increase soil organic carbon, bringing life back to the soil. And that is what James was talking about. We will not go very far if we continue to ignore the essence of organic matter into the soil that will be brought about by addition of organic carbon, which comes from organic farm inputs, whether they're fertilizers, soil conditioners, biostimulants, biofertilizers, but organic carbon is the key. When we bring life back into our soils, then our soils will be able to behave the way they should, retain the nutrients that they need to retain the water that we are saying is very scarce. So even in as much as we are talking about water harvesting, irrigation, it still will not work as well if we do not have enough organic matter in the soil to maintain that moisture. So we cannot belabor it. So we have to intentionally inject as much carbon as we can, because we are actually at a deficit as Kenya, as Africa. Given the fact that we are living in the tropics, we are already predisposed to soil degradation just naturally. And then we are overmining our soils. Our soils are not regenerating. So it's not maybe, it's a must do, which means we must equip our extension services. And our first speaker talked about, the manpower. We need to reinvest in the number of people who are visiting the farmers and what are they advising the farmers. So the conversation today should be about how much organic carbon do you have in your farm. So it's not really a question of yes, it's important to know what is the NPK, but if we are only measuring NPK and not keeping track of the soil organic carbon, then we are not doing any justice towards our soils. So we need to change the conversation at the farm level so that we can be able to change and to improve our soil health and increase our productivity.
Thank you so much, Junie. I think in terms of soil health, this is also something that we're consistently speaking about at AGRA, and I'm really glad to hear you bring out this point. On that note, we've come to the end of our webinar, and I just want to close with a reflection as well in terms of the discussion we've had. I think from a selfish point, these webinars have become very informative for me as an individual. So I'm hoping that our audience is also gaining the same level of information that I've been able to gain over the last months that we've been doing this. So with that said, please ensure to look out for the one we will host in July. We also welcome you providing us topics of what you would want for us to cover and conversations that you would want us to explore further. We have very many partners that we work with as AGRA that are also happy to come and have the conversation. But much more, it's not just about talking about the pieces that are working or just what are the challenges. It's important that we also surface the tension so that we're able to move forward. I think that we all have a common goal for our continent, even though sometimes we have differing viewpoint on how we get there. The important point is that we continue to have these discussions to move our agriculture transformation and food systems transformation. On that note, my deepest thank you to Professor Tilahoon, James Mtonyi, and the team at AFAP, Juni and Ofimac for agreeing to co-host this webinar with us, your insightful contributions. To our audience on YouTube. I think we had a glitch with being able to stream to LinkedIn, but that will still be provided in due course. Thank you very much to everybody that engaged in the chat, that challenged us to think a little bit more about things that we were discussing. On that note, thank you very much. Good night, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you again. Bye-bye. My name is Mwandwe. This has been the AGRA webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.